me up in your Bibles, if you would, to Matthew the 10th chapter. Matthew chapter 10. While you're turning there, allow me a brief moment to say thank you for being here, and your attendance here and your participation in the song service and all of that is extremely encouraging to me, and I know it's encouraging to everybody else, so we're thankful for that. We're thankful for the good men that we've had to lead services today with Ray leading our singing, Lee doing our scripture reading, the ones that led the prayers, the ones that helped with the Lord's Supper. Got a lot of good men here that do a lot of various things. That's something that not a lot of churches are blessed with, but we certainly are, especially at this location. One thing I did want to say on top of what Ray said a second ago about the funeral yesterday is that there's somebody else that did a great job yesterday, and that's Tommy. Tommy led singing yesterday. I thought he did a fantastic job with that as well. Overall, very beautiful service, and I think hopefully very fitting for somebody who impacted this church quite a bit and a lot of people here at End. We also want to make mention, I didn't get to James before services started, but we also want to make mention of the fact that yesterday Jason and Jessica were married last night. And so if you haven't gotten a chance to say hi to them and thank them for that, Jessica isn't here. She had to work this morning. She's actually working, I think, 7 days a week for the next couple of weeks. It's a new, tough job she's got. But very happy time, very happy moment for them yesterday. So if you haven't, slide on over there, push Travis out of the way, and say congratulations to them. Tomorrow is a big day, I know, for a lot of people. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then it probably doesn't affect you a whole lot. But I know for a lot of people here, tomorrow is going to be a big day because it is the first day of school. I'm sure there are a lot of parents this morning that are jumping up because their kids are leaving. There's probably a lot of teachers that are weeping openly at the floor thinking this is the start of a new year. There's a lot of kids that are equally excited, I'm sure, as you can tell from the picture behind me. But the first day of school is always interesting. It's always fun because it's kind of a new adventure. You've got a lot of different things going on. Who's your new teacher going to be? What are your subjects going to be? How are you going to do this year? Will you get a B instead of a C? That was always my goal every year. I'm going to do a little bit better than I did the year before. But it's just filled with so many new expectations. Of course, alongside that, what you also come to is the idea of a lot of new people. There's a lot of new people that you'll interact with, classmates you may have never seen before, and so there's going to be a lot of new interactions that you'll have. And in a lot of ways, that's a good thing. You make new friends that you've never known before, you make new acquaintances, maybe, I guess as was referenced earlier, maybe there's new girls there you didn't know were there before. There's a whole lot of new opportunities. I think for a lot of people, though, it can be kind of stressful, and especially for a Christian, it can be kind of a difficult time. When I was growing up in Amarillo, the school that I went to, Amarillo High School, was a 5A school. It was one of 4 5A high schools in a town that boasted over 200,000 people. I actually graduated with a class of 530 people. I met the people that sat either side of me on graduation day. I didn't even know they were in my class. I met them literally that day. To kind of flip on the other side, the church where I attended was about 150, and we had a pretty good-sized young people group, about 10 people. But I can count to you on one hand the number of times I saw anybody from that young people group actually in school. And so what that means, and that wasn't by design, I wasn't trying to avoid anybody, that's just kind of how the chips fell. But what that shows you is that there's a lot of times, especially as a Christian, where you're navigating those hallways by yourself. You're facing temptations every day by yourself. You're going through rough times and you're being invited to parties and you're having to turn down those things. You're having to stand up for your faith and talk about biblical things by yourself. And that can be pretty stressful. But I got news for you. As far as I know, of course, it's not the way with my work, but I know as soon as you graduate and then you enter college, then you enter the workforce, that really doesn't slow down a whole lot. If you work at a place where there's a lot of people, you interact with that a lot, it's the exact same thing. You're not going to see a whole lot of Christians there as well. And so for most of your lifestyle, I'm sorry to kind of bring this to a downer, but most of your life you will stand up for your faith by yourself. And that's why Sunday mornings and Wednesday nights are so helpful, because you kind of get that recharge at the beginning, get that recharge halfway through the week. But most of the time we stand up for our faith, we resist temptations, we stand strong by ourselves. But when you think about it, that's what Christians have always been called to do. You look at Matthew the 10th chapter, you start in verse 5 here, right before Jesus is sending the apostles. And these apostles also would spend a lot of their time by themselves. The apostles would be going to different places, Britannia, Egypt, the eastern part of the empire, all these different places, mostly by themselves. And so in Matthew chapter 10, starting in verse 5, it says, "These 12 Jesus sent out after instructing them, saying, 'Do not go in the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter any city of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. Freely you have received, freely also give. Do not acquire gold or silver or copper for your money belts, or a bag for your journey, or even 2 coats, or sandals, or a staff, for the worker is worthy of his support. Verse 11, whatever city or village you enter, inquire who is worthy in it, and and say to his house until you leave that city. As you enter that house, give it your greeting. If the house then is worthy, give it your blessing of peace. But if it is not worthy, take back your blessing of peace. Whoever does not receive you nor heed your words, as you go out of that house and out of that city, shake the dust off your feet. Truly I say to you, verse 15, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. What Jesus is doing here in Matthew the 10th chapter is he's just finally gotten the apostles delegated. He knows who those people are after he spent a night on the mountain in prayer. He's delegated these 12 apostles. Now he's sending them out. And what he's doing here in Matthew the 10th chapter, starting at verse 5 and going through verse 15, is he's preparing these apostles physically. He says, when you go out there and you are doing your work, I don't want you to take a second staff. I don't want you to take a staff at all. I won't want you to take 2 coats. I don't want you to take a money bag. I don't want you to take any of those things. There's a deeper meaning behind him saying that than just, I want you to go out there and kind of fend for yourself. There's a deeper meaning than that. The deeper meaning is, I want you to learn to depend on me. I want you to know, apostles, that physically, I'm going to be there. I may not always keep you from persecution. The apostles endured mouths of persecution. But I will always be there to take care of you. I will always help you find what you need. And sure enough, later when the apostles would circle back around and Jesus asked them, did you lack anything for your journey? They responded with, no. We had everything that we needed. And so in this first section, what he's doing is he's preparing them physically. But focusing on verse 16. He says, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. That's the key verse for our lesson this morning. Beware of men, verse 17, for they will hand you over to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues, and you will even be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. But when they hand you over, don't worry about how or what you are to say. For it will be given you in that hour what you are to say. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. Verse 21. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but it is the one who has endured to the end who will be saved. Verse 23. Whenever they persecute you in one city, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. What's he doing in this passage? In Matthew the 10th chapter, starting in verse 5 and going through verse 15, we just said that he's preparing these people physically. When you go out, don't take these necessary things for a very specific reason. But starting in verse 16, what he starts doing is preparing these people spiritually. He says, you're going to go into these different areas and you are going to face mounds of persecution. And all you have to do is look into the traditional historical logs of what happened to the apostles in their various places. You don't have to look very far to see that that's exactly what they endured. You can read the Acts of the Apostles and see what Paul himself endured traveling from place to place. And so in a special commission to these people, he says, when you go and stand before all these people, what I want you to do is stand before them boldly. Because in that day that you stand before them, it will be told you what you need to do. But if you notice in verse 16, he gives them a little bit of a hint of what he's going to do. When you go out with these people, you interact with all these different groups of people, I want you, verse 16, to be shrewd as serpents. And I want you to be innocent as doves. That's an interesting conundrum, isn't it? When you look at these 2 animals and you think him saying, I want you to be as shrewd as serpents, and I think I want you to be as innocent as doves, those 2 animals seem like polar opposites. It's almost as if Jesus is saying, I want you to be as enthusiastic as fire, but I want you to be as calm as ice. It's kind of a little bit of a paradox. And so when Jesus tells them to be shrewd as serpents and be innocent as doves, what he's doing is telling them how to handle it. I want you, when you go out to these various places, to handle it intelligently. There's 2 sides of this opposition. There's 2 sides of this coin. When opposition faces you, and it can either be really intense, or it can be not intense. It can be in your face, or it can be kind of subdued. It can be from all sorts of people, or it can be from one person. Whenever you enter these various situations, I want you to be as shrewd as serpents, but I want you to be as innocent as doves. What he's really talking about when he discusses this, and he bleeds into verse 16 down to the end of the chapter, what he's talking about is living and preaching in a way that is effective, but that doesn't beat people over the head with it. Using wisdom and discernment in every different type of situation. Somebody once told me, and I think very accurately, that there's two ways to tell people something. You can either tell people in a way that they will reject you, or you can tell it in a way that people will accept you. Even if they disagree with your message, they'll at least accept you for that. Too many people, I think, in today's world, when they talk about preaching the gospel, they think of the people standing on street corners and they yell at the top of their lungs how everybody's going to be condemned. Everybody that rolls up on them, you're condemned, you're condemned, you're condemned. It's kind of a bizarre version of that Oprah scene where she gives away cars to everybody. You're condemned, you're condemned. We tend to think of that's what it is. But when Jesus tells these people, go out there and be shrewd as serpents, which designs this kind of cunningness, this wisdom, but be as innocent as doves, it's a harmless approach to it. Jesus himself would say, speak the truth in love. Speak the truth, but do it in love. Paul the Apostle himself did this. Look at 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. You can see this yourself, 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Look at the way that Jesus approaches this. Paul approaches this. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, starting in verse 19. Listen to how Paul describes his approach. Starting in verse 19, he says, for though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all. That's the key phrase. So that I may win more. There's the goal. To the Jews I became as a Jew so that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. That's kind of a confusing phrase, but stay with me. Verse 21. To those who are without the law, talking about a different demographic, as without law. Though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may be all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. What he's describing in this passage is the end goal of preaching. The end goal of all preaching, of all teaching, of all exhortation, of all approaches to the gospel. The end goal is to win souls. Case closed. The end goal is to win souls. And so when Paul says here in 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, verses 19 down to verse 23, and he says, to the Jew I became as a Jew so that I might win the Jew, what he's talking about is every extraneous or every extemporaneous factor that may inhibit that message, I'm removing that. If you don't like me because you don't think that I'm Jewish enough for you, then I'll show you what Jewishness really means. If maybe he's talking as a Jew, and he was a Jew obviously, but now he's approaching the Gentiles, and the Gentiles look at him and he's got some strange customs. You hold the rituals, you hold the feasts. Paul, understanding that he did not need to keep those anymore as a Christian, says, I'm not even going to make that a deal. I'm not going to make that a deal. When he approaches the Greeks in Acts chapter 17, he stands on the Acropolis, and he's standing up there in this great oratory of speech. He doesn't come to them talking about the Passover. You see what I'm saying? He comes to them talking about wisdom and breaks it down using their own prophets to show them and to teach them about the resurrection of Christ. What Paul does in 1 Corinthians 19 is, I'm going to get all the things that don't matter out of the way, and I'm just going to bring the gospel to them. Now there's a key difference here. Paul never, this is where a lot of people in today's world get it wrong, Paul never once ever altered the gospel in order to appease people. And that's an important point. Oftentimes when we talk to people in today's world, they say, well, I'm with you 99%, but I can't get on that baptism train with you. I cannot get on that with you. I don't agree with that. The temptation sometimes is to minimize that. To say, well, baptism is, it's important, but it's not everything. It's not necessary. So we'll just kind of skip over that and move on to the next thing. That's the temptation. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul never changed the gospel. He never altered the gospel to appeal to a mass audience like people in today's world do. When he says, I brought the gospel to all people so that I may all means save some, he's talking about all the extemporaneous things that don't matter. I'm removing them so that you can just hear the message of Christ. That's the end goal, to save souls. Paul understood also in 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, that it largely did not depend upon his own eloquence. Look in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Paul understood that it did not depend on his own eloquence. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, starting in verse 10. 1 Corinthians 1, starting in verse 10. Listen to what he has to say here. He says, "Now I exhort you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all agree, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be made complete in the same mind and in the same judgment." There's that unity that we're shooting for. Verse 11, "For I have been informed concerning you by my brethren, by Chloe's people, that there are actually quarrels among you. Now I mean this, that each one of you is saying, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas, I am of Christ. Has Christ then been divided? Was Paul not crucified, or was Paul not crucified for you, was he? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul?" Verse 14, "I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one would say that you were baptized in my name." Listen to his approach here in verse 16. "I did baptize also," actually starting a verse earlier, verse 16, "Now I did baptize also the household of Stephanas. Beyond that, I don't know whether I baptized any other." Verse 17, here's the approach. "Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not in cleverness of speech, so that the cross of Christ would not be made void." That's a temptation sometimes that we have, that we think, in order to preach the gospel, what I need to do is I need to be eloquent. I need to be clever. I need to craft the gospel in such a way that it's going to appeal to this person. Kind of like a little bit of a bait and switch. If I can make him think that he's hearing a story about NASCAR, and then switch it up, and now he's hearing the gospel, maybe that's what I need to do. Paul said that wasn't his main approach. He didn't come to them trying to use cleverness of speech and try to get people into himself. He came preaching the gospel. The emphasis was, and always is, the gospel. So that begs the question then. How do we bring the gospel to other people? How can we use it in a way that he describes here? Be as shrewd as serpents, but as harmless as doves. I think what it speaks to ultimately is using wisdom in every different type of circumstance. And one of the biggest, I think, villains of the Christian world in today's society is the group known as Westboro Baptist Church. I was going to put a big picture of them up here, but I'll be honest, I couldn't find one picture that didn't have incredibly vulgar writings on it and felt comfortable showing up here to everybody else. But when you look at Westboro Baptist Church and you see their approach to the gospel, they're out there, they're putting it in your face. But you cannot say with any realistic credibility that they're fulfilling the second half of that, being innocent as doves, being harmless as a dove would. And because of that, when people hear that message, whenever people hear their approach to the gospel, they react and associate Jesus with this negative perception, and they think, well, Jesus obviously hates everybody. Your God is a vengeful God. And that approach brings reproach upon the gospel of God. What we have to do when we're looking at this, "Behold, I send you as sheep in the midst of wolves," being shrewd as serpents and being innocent as doves, what we have to do is bring the gospel and use the gospel in our own lives with an extreme amount of wisdom for the most effect for the kingdom of God. I want to finish out this morning. I know this is going pretty quick, but I want to finish out this morning with two quick illustrations. I want you to turn to Mark the 8th chapter. Mark chapter 8. I want you to see this extreme amount of wisdom used in the life of Jesus. We're going to look at it in two very briefly. Mark the 8th chapter, starting in verse 27, which just happened right before this. The feeding of the 4,000. It's a different miracle than the feeding of the 5,000. But Mark the 8th chapter, Jesus has an honest question that he wants these people to know, or wants these people to answer. These people, I mean his apostles. Same thing that Jesus would say in Matthew 16. But in Mark the 8th chapter, starting in verse 27, it says, "Jesus went out along with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he questioned his disciples, saying to them, 'Well, who do people say that I am?'" Keep in mind, this is between Jesus and his intimate apostles. "And some said unto him, 'Well, John the Baptist,' others say Elijah, but others, they say one of the prophets," which is a great list, by the way. I would have loved to be included even remotely near that list. He continued, though, by questioning him, saying, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." And verse 30 is the peculiar verse. Because after this great confession, look at what Jesus does in verse 30. It says, he warned them to tell no one about him. You see this a couple more occasions within the Gospels, where Jesus would look at his disciples and say, "You know who I am. But don't spread it that much right now. Don't go out telling people. Don't go out screaming it from the rafters. Don't tell people who I am, at least right now." The question then becomes, why did Jesus do that? What was the point of Jesus saying here, Mark the 8th chapter, verse 30, "Don't tell anybody who I am"? Flip the script a little bit. Go to Acts the 4th chapter. Acts chapter 4. I believe Kyle Crumpton used this in an invitation not long ago. I thought he made excellent points. I'm not going to make the points that he did because he's got copyright laws on them. I don't want to pay him royalties. But in Acts the 4th chapter, starting in verse 16, it's the same type of idea. After this fantastic discussion that they then have, and Peter and John are arrested for their faith, look at verse 16. These people that are arresting him then get together and say, "What shall we do with these men? For the fact that a noteworthy miracle has taken place through them is apparent to all who live in Jerusalem." And we can't deny it. That's a rare admission. Verse 17, "But so that it will not spread any further among the people, let us warn them to speak no longer to any man in this name." In verse 18, when they had summoned them, they commanded them, Peter and John, not to speak or to teach at all in the name of Jesus. Now keep in mind, this was the exact same commandment that Jesus gave them. Mark chapter 8 and verse 30. Don't speak any more about who I am. But look at Peter and John's response in verse 19. Peter and John answered and said back to them, "Whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge." Verse 20, listen to this, verse 20. "We cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard." Now that's an interesting response. When you go back to Mark the 8th chapter and you look in verse 30, what Jesus says is, "You have answered correctly. You identified who I am. But I'm telling you, don't tell people about it right now." In Acts the 4th chapter, the people, Peter and John, are standing here before the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin tells them the exact same thing. Don't tell anybody about Jesus. And yet, what's Peter and John's response back to that? We can't stop preaching the gospel. The question is, why in one case was it okay? And why in the other case was it not okay? It goes back to this realm of wisdom. It goes back to the whole idea of being strategic, being wise in your approach to the gospel. When you look at the timeline of both Matthew chapter 16 and Mark the 8th chapter, and you look at where Jesus was, he was outside of Jerusalem, and it was not too deep into his ministry. He had accomplished quite a bit of things, but it was not super deep into his ministry. And what Jesus realized, at least at that point, is if the acclaim about him came about and if all the noise and the notoriety came about, then he would be persecuted and killed before his time. That's a strategic decision in order to fulfill the prophecies that were made about him. Jesus wasn't saying, "Don't ever talk about me." He was saying, choose the right time to talk about me. Acts chapter 4 was the right time. Now someone would say here, if they're trying to apply this situation themselves, they would say, "Well, I'm in this situation. I've talked to my friend about the gospel for weeks and weeks and weeks. I can't seem to find the right time. I just can't seem to find really that right time." We try to use this as an excuse. The time isn't right now. You know who else could find the right time? Agrippa. Agrippa never found the right time. And sometimes the temptation is, whenever we approach this, we think we're being wise. We think we're being savvy and clever in our approach to the gospel by saying, "Well, it's just not the right opportunity." Over time, that lack of opportunity turns into blatant cowardice. And it is totally different than what Jesus did in this situation. That was a strategic move in order to fulfill the prophecies so that he would not be persecuted and murdered outside of Jerusalem, according to what the prophecies said he would be. Totally different thing. If you're sitting here this morning, you're thinking to yourself, "It's just not the right time. I would love to talk to these people, but it's just not the right time." Check your motivation. Ask yourself if you are confusing your wisdom or your cowardice. Is it really the right time? Am I being as shrewd as a serpent should be? One of my favorite stories in the entire New Testament comes in Acts the 23rd chapter because it reveals a cunning heart within the life of Paul. I think is very noteworthy. Acts chapter 23, starting in verse 1, Paul is on his way to Jerusalem, which he's already been told that in Jerusalem is where he's going to eventually be killed. Or he's going to testify, rather, not killed. Be killed in Rome. In Acts chapter 23, starting in verse 1, that comes in between a triumvirate of speeches that Paul would make. Paul would stand before one ruler in chapter 22, another one in chapter 24, another one in chapter 26. This is a different situation. He's also giving a defense in chapter 23. It's a little bit of a different situation. Paul, chapter 23, starting in verse 1, says, Paul, looking intently at the council, said, "Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." That's a very uninflammatory type statement. If I stood before you and said, "I've lived in all good conscience up to this day," you would probably blow that off and not think twice about it. Well, look at verse 2. The high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike Paul on the mouth. Paul then said in verse 3, one of the rare times where we see a lot of anger from him, Paul says to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? That's a great response. If you're looking for a zinger that you can just shoot back, try using the whitewashed wall response. That really works well with a lot of people. The bystanders then said, do you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I was not aware. Whether or not he's being sarcastic in this instance or he truly was not aware is up for debate. But Paul said, I was not aware, brethren, that he was high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So he plays the defense card. Now Paul finds himself in an interesting situation here at the end of verse 5 because he's standing in front of what would eventually be a divided crowd. The Sanhedrin was made up of 70 people, and it was made up of two general camps, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. All of them hated Paul. All of them wanted to see him killed. And Paul has just insulted the high priest sitting in front of them. One of them's punched him in the face. He realizes that he's kind of on a short leash here. But Paul does something, I think, very wise and something very cunning in verse 6. Perceiving, verse 6, that one group were Sadducees, the other group was Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of the Pharisees, and I am on trial for the hope and the resurrection of the dead. That's a strategic move that Paul said precisely because of what's going to happen here in verse 7. As he said this, there then occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was then divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, that's why it's Sadducee, nor an angel nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. That's why it's fair you see, because they acknowledge the resurrection. See what I did there? That's not creative from me. Stole that from somebody else. Verse 9. There occurred a great uproar, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, remember, they used to hate him, began to argue heatedly, saying, we find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or angel has spoken to him. Let's just imagine that maybe an angel or a spirit has talked to him. Verse 10. A great dissension was then developing, and the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down, take him away from them by force, and bring him into the barracks. You see what Paul did in Acts chapter 23. You notice the cunningness that he used. Paul, at the beginning of this chapter, in Acts chapter 23, is standing in front of a group of people that absolutely hate him. And his murder and his persecution is not far off coming. And Paul, perceiving the situation, seeing Pharisees and Sadducees split down the middle, knowing that there's a great debate between them about one theological situation, then makes a defense that he's on trial for preaching about Jesus from the resurrection of the dead. Was he? Yes. But why did he accentuate the resurrection from the dead? Because he wanted to drive a wedge in between the Pharisees and Sadducees and make them turn on each other instead of on him. And Paul lived to preach another day. And in case you're wondering, yes, Jesus did the exact same thing on numerous occasions. Jesus would inflame the crowd, would say something totally inflammatory to all of them, and then what would it say? He would kind of pass through them, whatever that's supposed to mean. So Paul, in this instance, was not exercising cowardice any more than Jesus, on numerous occasions, did not exercise cowardice. What he was doing was he was being as shrewd as a serpent, being harmless as a dove. You may find yourself, whether tomorrow is your first day of school or whether tomorrow is your 3,000th day of work, you may find yourself in a situation where you're confronted, maybe not where they're about to kill you, maybe they punch you in the face at one point, but you may find yourself in a situation where you're confronted. It may not be aggressive, it may be very passive, but you may find yourself in a situation where you need to stand up for your faith, and it's kind of a zero-sum game at that point. The question is, how are you going to get out of it? How are you going to stand up for your faith? How are you going to defend your faith the most effectively and in the manner that God wants you to? That's the question. Are you going to stand up like Westboro Baptist Church and tell all of them that they're going to hell? Or are you going to be meek and humble in your response the way God would want you to? One of the most overlooked passages, or one of the most overlooked concepts about the entire Bible is the simple statement that God expects us to use our brain. I know that sounds very simple. But a lot of times that goes overlooked. Because we tend to think that because the Bible has given us all things that matter according to life and godliness, 2 Peter chapter 1, which it has, that we think we can just go on autopilot. And we can just shut our brain off and go throughout our daily life not really thinking about much of anything. God expects us to be smart. God expects us to be godly. But He expects us to be wise, especially when we're talking to other people. The last passage we'll look at is James, the 3rd chapter. Flip over there. James chapter 3. James chapter 3, starting in verse 13. James writes, "Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom." You notice that theme there? Verse 14, "But if you have a bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder, and every evil thing." Verse 17, "But the wisdom from above is first pure, then it's peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." So let me ask you here this morning, what's your motivation for spreading the gospel? Is your motivation for spreading the gospel just so you can become the world's most popular evangelist, that you can rack up souls by the thousands? Or are you truly trying to sow peace in the hearts of people by joining them towards Christ? What's your motivation? Tomorrow morning when you go out into this world, what is going to be your approach to the gospel? Are you going to be in your face, aggressive, up front? Are you going to be the coward and just kind of hang back and think, well, maybe another time's more appropriate? Or are you and I going to be as shrewd as serpents and yet harmless as doves? What's your approach to the gospel this morning? If you have need of the gospel call, we have this opportunity to lay it out for anybody that needs to come forward and make the confession right with God, to issue the sins that are on their heart, and to ask for the prayers of the congregation to help them, and to support them in their path towards God. If we can help you in any way, won't you come as we stand and sing?